Ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Dallas, Texas, it's the Yankee Cowboy Podcast with your host, Tim Wilkins, where he talks all things pro wrestling and sports. Let's go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Yankee Cowboy Podcast. I am joined by my co-host yet again, Christopher, and we're going to be talking about today's big topic in the world of NASCAR, Kyle Busch leaving Joe Gibbs Racing and the Toyota manufacturer to go to RCR, Richard Childress Racing, and that prestige history, and Chevrolet. As well as we might throw some NFL in there, heck, even some UFC from over the weekend, who knows. But lastly, joined by my co-host, Christopher. Thank you for joining me as always, Chris. I appreciate you taking me this late and having fun. Hopefully you're not going to yawn and have all that fun stuff.
Oh, man, that's why I got a mute button.
Oh, it's a magical thing. So today, man, it's actually a fun, I don't know, man. I think the rumor came out by The Athletic on Friday. By the way, I was going to ask you how your weekend was, but I'm pretty sure we already gone through all that. But I think it was pretty eventful with all the stuff going on you had.
Oh, yeah. It was spent most of the weekend on the other coast, the left coast. So
you mean the West Coast? The West Coast.
Yeah. Let it fall into the Pacific Ocean. But had a red eye home and got an hour of sleep. Had a person next to me who had restless leg syndrome, and another person next to me who just couldn't stop moving. And when you're over 6 feet tall, crammed into the economy class, it's not a lot of fun.
Well, here's the bright news for you. At least your flights weren't canceled, delayed, or in other words, just like the rest of America. And by the way, if you have stocks, I feel bad for you right now. I'm mourning for your IRA and your 401k. Make sure you vote early and vote often. And that being said, let's talk about today's topic. I think Kyle Busch, like I was telling you, the sports came out, the Athletic came out with the leak on Friday by good old J-Ski. Came out that he was going to go to RCR on Friday. And I don't think anyone's really surprised, Chris, on whether or not he was going to leave JGR. It was just a matter of where he was going to land. And I think this move is very monumental for the developmental drivers in the other series as well. And I think that's the reason why we had this conversation today is the implications that really what this move has for the rest of the sport. Obviously not for the driver's standpoint, but obviously, Kyle Busch is well-known, well-respected for his racecraft and his ability to win races. But this has a pretty shifted the globe, really, in the world of racing. So want to see what your opinion was on it and kind of go from here, what we want to talk about.
Well, if you look at it from this perspective, this is probably the biggest free agent move in NASCAR since probably Dale Earnhardt Jr. when he left Dale Earnhardt Incorporated at the end of 2007 and went to Hendrick Motorsport. I think it came from the perspective of there were probably 3 to 4 big players that were in the Kyle Busch lottery. I think you had Joe Gibbs Racing, which did make offers to Kyle, but could not meet the financial means that he wanted. We had heard rumors that Kyle's making upwards of $14 million a year base salary before any other incentives in his contract. Gibbs made an offer at around $10 million that he declined, and I think from there it really kind of fell apart in terms of keeping him in the 18 car past 2022. Stewart Haas Racing, I believe, made an offer to try and get Kyle into the Ford camp. And then also 2 Chevy teams with Colleague Racing made an offer, and then obviously where he did sign today which was with Richard Childress Racing. So there were definitely a lot of players. Also throw in there was an outside chance of 2311 potentially putting him in the car with not knowing the future of his brother Kurt, whether he'll be back from his concussion he sustained at Pocono earlier this year. So there definitely was a lot of interest in what was going on out there. But when it came down to it, Kyle had to make a decision that he felt was in the best interest of not only his career, but the long-term stability of Kyle Busch Motorsports and 50 or 60 employees that worked there, and then also factoring in, and he made no qualms about it, the hope that his young son Brexton will eventually continue on with his racing career, and eventually they'd be able to share a truck ride in the latter part of Kyle's career and in the early part of Brexton's career. So definitely some things from that perspective that he had to look at long term, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, man. I think like we were talking. I think we were talking off air about some of these things. I think the one thing that kind of stuck out to me was, the ability or the inability of Toyota to kind of step in as the manufacturer and really just. I'm not sure. Like, I don't know the details. Of course, a lot of fans don't know the details of the negotiation. A lot of that stuff is rumored and things like that. But there was rumors early on in this year that JGR had a sponsor. I think it was a tech firm that they were really close to signing as a sponsor for a full year. Obviously, the sponsor that they were main reason why this even got out of hand was obviously the company that owns M&M's and that whole candy company pretty much said, "Hey, we're not coming back next year," which left the funding of that race car up in the air, as well as driver's salary. And driver's salary, I think we both agree with that. Driver salary has, at one point, was extremely high, and with a lot of these major head corporations leaving the sport, it kind of has come down to earth a bit. So with Kyle Busch getting if that's true, that $10 million offer a year, which is only a $4 million a year concession. If you think about that, Chris, it's only a $4 million a year concession to stay with the manufacturer that you've done for 15 years. I mean, it's a long-term relationship. I know the sports analogy is always everyone talks about Tom Brady staying to pay in the world of New England. And heck, we can go down the list of Mariano Rivera staying in the Yankees organization, Derek Jeter, all those guys. But this was definitely a monumental move in the world of sports because the guy was there after he got out. Maybe we could talk about the history of this. Kyle Busch left Hendrick Motorsports on contentious terms. And him to get picked up by JGR was pretty big at the time as well.
Yeah, I mean, you look at it from the perspective of, Kyle, make a quick Cliff Notes version of his career. He, came up through, out west, born in Las Vegas. Was a few years younger than, obviously, younger brother of Kurt Busch, the 2004 Cup Series champion. Kyle started his career, really got on the main stage back in the early 2000s, 2001. Was actually a Roush development driver. Ran a few truck races for Roush at the age of 16. Back when you could race. Now the rule's gone back where you can race on tracks under a mile at 16. But Kyle ran several truck races for Roush. Ran in what was the old ASA series. And then unfortunately nothing really came of it at Roush. So he in 2003 moved over to Hendrick Motorsports as a development driver. Ran a part-time schedule, both ARCA and then was then the Busch Series. Ran a couple full seasons, ran 2 full seasons or 1 full season, sorry, with Hendrick's Busch team in 2004. Won, I believe, 4 or 5 races. Won Rookie of the Year. Nearly won the championship. And then was tasked to replace Terry Labonte in the Kellogg's number 5 in 2005. Picked up his first Cup win at Fontana in 2005. And as you mentioned, just didn't have the success, I believe, that at Hendrick Motorsports, and then left there at the end of 2007, and then with JGR from 2008 until the end of this year. So 15 years, tons of wins, well over 150 wins with the organization with Joe Gibbs Racing. So definitely the end of a legacy there. Kyle, I think really put. I mean, obviously Bobby Labonte had success winning the championship in 2000 in the 18 car, but it has to be said that the 18 car with Kyle Busch and Mars and M&M's was really put on the map by Kyle Busch for sure.
Yeah, and I think, like I was talking about this earlier, is Toyota, if the driver's salary, or let's just say the race funding, this is where we're talking about this in off air, if the opportunity came to Toyota was like, listen, obviously KBM is a developmental team, Kyle Busch Motorsports for all listeners out there, the truck team, has 3 developmental drivers for Toyota in it right now. Joe Hunter Nemechek and a couple other drivers as well. Toyota could have stepped in and said, "Hey, we're going to sponsor your car outright for the year, so the car's fully funded." Would that have changed the negotiation tactic with Kyle and said, "Hey, listen, I'll take the $10 million salary"? Obviously, today's announcement, the salary of Kyle Busch has not been released to the public. It's obviously a multi.
Nor will we never see it.
Yeah,
Most
yep.
of these NASCAR salaries, you're always going to, anytime you see a NASCAR contract, it always says a multi-year deal. There's unlike most other professional sports where you see a nominal number, whether it be signing bonus or the whole contract itself. Right in NASCAR or in most motorsports, it's very vague. They'll say that the driver's on a multi-year contract, so it really depends on the organization itself. And typically, these contracts will have an option year tacked onto it with the team. So, so the way contracts are presented in NASCAR or in most motorsports is significantly different from other sports.
Oh, absolutely, and that's where I think, as a fan, that you always hear the word multi-year on any press release. You kind of just smile, or a multi-year commitment, or a multi-race commitment on a sponsor. You always kind of laugh and go, "Okay, so we're gonna do like 2 races? That counts multi?" But no, the reason why I really want to bring this topic into the forefront is that now with this move with Kyle Busch Motorsports and Toyota seizing their basically their relationship, it changes the dynamic for the other series of the racing world. I mean, right now you had a driver like John Hunter Nemechek, not Joe, his son, leave a full-time Cup ride, which arguably could have been like a drive and park, or park and ride, or ride and park, whatever you want to call it. It was a full-time ride.
A mid-pack team.
Okay, let's just go with that. A mid-pack team. It was a mid-pack team. He was a full-time ride, and he left that ride, which I'm not sure how lucrative a ride that was, but it was still a full-time Cup ride, to go back to Kyle Busch Motorsports and gather a championship and win races, which he has done. So that being said, that young man has a heck of a next 6 or 8 months here to figure out what exactly does he do. Obviously, they have other part-time drivers there as well, but Toyota used Kyle Busch Motorsports as a developmental team to help groom and get their race car drivers up to the standards there, and now we don't have that, and obviously they don't have that in the Xfinity series. Very limited. What was that?
Well, you have Joe Gibbs Racing there. Toyota
well, I mean, it's a very limited. You got 25 drivers. It's not not that great. But
yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting long term because from the perspective of, and Kyle made no qualms about it, that he was looking at the long term stability of his race team, his organization, and I think when you look at the totality of it, I mean, he's seen several careers come out of Kyle Busch Motorsports, whether it be Eric Jones or Christopher Bell or Daniel Suarez drove truck races for him. There's been a Harrison Burton most recently. There's been a lot of talent that's come out of that pipeline, and yes, Kyle Busch Motorsports has become a proverbial pipeline to the next level, which is the out of the ARCA series into trucks and then into the Xfinity series and hopefully into the Cup series. So that is going to be interesting. I mean, there are other Toyota teams when you look at Thor Sport Racing, which is they're based out of Ohio, so they're obviously one of the longest standing truck teams in they're one of the original truck teams. So it'll be interesting to see what happens long term, whether this team and this organization, where it will go. I mean, obviously they're going to go to Chevrolet. We don't know who the lineup is going to be. Typically, those lineups are not finalized till December or sometimes as early as or as late as January. So it'll be interesting to see how the pieces. So really the first puzzle piece is falling. Kyle is leaving the organization. Is leaving JGR, and then subsequently will that pipeline therefore Toyota will come to an end. So where will Toyota take their their drivers who are under contract to them, and where will they place them?
Well, that's one thing I was going to ask is how exactly does that work? Are you getting funded sponsor? Is the car being funded by Toyota when it comes to a sponsorship style deal? Or is the
Yeah, I
driver
mean,
being sponsored and they bring money? Because obviously we could talk about that in a whole other episode of how the sport has drastically changed over the years for how much money they're bringing to the table and how much are they actually acquiring through, business to business relationships. And it's just baffling to me that Toyota didn't really make a stake here and say, Joe Gibbs, we'll front the money. Like it didn't seem like there was much of a. Kyle Busch is a Hall of Fame talent. They always say, oh, Kyle Larson's a generational talent. Kyle Busch arguably has won a ton of races and done really well in all three series of the racing series. He's a generational talent for a lot of drivers, for a lot of people, a lot of fans. But it for him to go to RCR, there had to, especially. I'm not sure if you listened to the presser today at all,
I did.
but our RC was as Richard Childress for all you listeners out there. He had no qualms with sticking Tyler Reddick out there the way that Tyler Reddick did him. If you listen to it, he said he called him an hour before the presser and said, "You're out of the 18. We're putting you into a third car. Oh, by the way, your crew chief, we're keeping it with the 8 car." Like there was no qualms of the relationship there going forward. Is definitely of scorched earth, which I don't blame RC. I don't blame at all.
Well, you got and you got to look at it from the perspective of Richard. Obviously, he wants long-term success for his organization. If you really think about it, and you look at Richard Childress Racing, you figure they've not won a Cup Series championship since the late Dale Earnhardt in 1994. They've had decent amounts of success over the last 20 plus years, but there really hasn't been sustained success from Richard Childress Racing since the 90s, since the early 90s. So, this really, from a perspective of Richard, is kind of his. It's obviously he's up in age, so this is one of those things where this could be his last real significant shot at getting Richard Childress Racing back to where it needs to be, or where it was for so many years. And bringing a guy like Tyler Reddick several years ago, him winning an Xfinity title for Richard Childress Racing, they had, and there were a lot of people that said that Tyler Reddick was the best talent that they had at that race team since Kevin Harvick, almost 20 years prior. So, from this perspective, I think this obviously makes the organization better. I think it makes.
I don't think there's any question, Chris, that the talent level of Kyle Busch that he brings to the table makes the organization better. It's just RC, in my opinion, Richard Childress Motorsports there. It was always, obviously with Austin Dillon being signed there, it kind of took the wind out of its sails in my view. Regardless of what people's views on Austin Dillon as a person, him getting his ride in the circumstances that he did, as a race fan, you kind of go, eh. It's like having Hendrick. It's like having Ricky Hendrick drive for Rick. Having Hendrick's son drive for Rick. It's very.
Which he did.
What he did. That was in a lower series, not the Cup Series. But like if you look at the drivers at KBM, obviously John Hunter Nemechek, Chandler Smith, and Corey Heim, and there's also Sammy Smith in the ARCA series. That's who's under that umbrella. As well as obviously Kyle Busch's son as well is under that organization. But can the drivers really negotiate and come back to Toyota and say, hey, listen, there's 40 drivers in your pipeline. I don't see a long-term situation here. And Chevy go, okay, we want you to stay in the ride. Like a guy like John Hunter Nemechek, is that a possibility, do you think?
I mean, I think a lot of it's just going to depend on what Toyota wants. I mean, kind of looking at the way Toyota does their program, they are very holistic in how they approach driver development. I think that they've taken the whole driver development program to a whole different level, even compared to the other manufacturers. They'll get kids that are straight out of quarter midgets and go karts, and then put them into midgets dirt midgets and sprint cars and stuff like that. And then from there, if they want to move over to pavement late models or late model stocks or super late models, Toyota has a pipeline. I think the challenge for Toyota is the number of seats that they have available. I think that's always kind of been the issue, is that we've got so many drivers. The problem is we don't have enough seats available. I mean, you figure when you look at right now in the Cup Series, I'll just use the Cup Series for example. Toyota only has 6, we'll say, factory entries. The four obviously JGR cars, and then the 2311 cars. So you figure if you have that many drivers coming through, it is very, very difficult to find seats for them. From a cost perspective, yeah, and we're not really sure how much right now what the funding is for a full year cup, but going off what the old kind of pre next gen, you're looking over $20 million a year. An Xfinity ride, a top tier Xfinity ride, is about $6 to $8 million, and a top tier truck ride is about $4 million a year. So it's not cheap, even to come up through the grassroots bottom level. Even an ARCA ride is probably well over $1.5 million per year. So you're talking pretty significant amounts of money just to field these kids up through these series with no guarantees on how they might be long term.
And I was going to, not to cut you off here, but we saw that last 2 years ago with Haley Deegan. And I know we don't want to talk about her talent level or any of that stuff, but we saw that relationship go from Toyota to Ford because of her development to where she wanted to go. And I think these kids, I call them kids because compared to us in age, they have to make some serious business decisions going forward. Because once you get to this level, truck series and up, it's really competitive for a seat. You have to have results, right?
Absolutely. No, there's no doubt about it. Yeah, it's all about results, and that leash that they give you is very, very, very small. So, there's not much time for these guys and girls to develop themselves for, to really see if they have what it takes to be a star and be a race winner on Sundays for sure. So there's no doubt about it.
I just think that in hindsight is 2020. Of course, I think there's going to come out and see what I was trying to figure out with that RC press release was they didn't announce any sponsor relationships like they did with 2311 when they first came out with the charter. But what would happen hypothetically if they went to the Colleague Racing or they went to Stewart Haas? Stewart Haas obviously is Ford. But with Colleague, I thought the RC and Colleague were the two guys that had the most money available to sign long-term deals. And it obviously showed here. Obviously, we won't know the money payout, so those drivers keep that close to the vest. But there's got to be some kind of discussion going forward with how these race teams acquire sponsorships and the way they do it, that it's kind of transparent to the public. Because I understand a lot of it's business to business. I get that. But the rumor came out that JGR had a sponsor for that car, for the 18 car. And we're talking about driver's salary. Well, why wouldn't JGR announce that sponsorship deal anyway for the 18 car for next year? Now we're dealing with 10 plates. Who's going to fill that ride? Gibbs?
Well,
Gibbs.
the short list right now is Ty Gibbs to go in that car. And I believe, obviously from the perspective of you can pay, if Kyle's wanting upwards of $10 to $12 million a year, and you could pay Ty Gibbs $750 to $1 million a year. I mean, just in base salary, I mean, that is a significant amount of savings that you can have. I mean, I think that's really, I think what we're seeing now is a shift, from these high driver salaries. If you look back over the last, I would say 7 or 8 years, and you see some of the guys who've lost rides or been replaced in rides. I mean, you look at it. First example would be Carl Edwards. I think Carl Edwards acquired quite a significant salary. He was replaced for Daniel Suarez. He's another JGR example. Matt Kenseth, he was a big salary guy, and he was replaced by Eric Jones. And now you're looking at a guy like Kyle Busch, who acquires a big salary, being replaced by Ty Gibbs. But you can even go further down, even other areas of the ground. Brad
But
Keselowski.
Chris, at some point though, the results are earned and the payout is earned. You know what I mean? So if I have 50 wins, I don't get deserved $50 or $8 million a salary or $10 million. Like,
No,
that's where I'm getting at. Some of these guys, I understand what you're saying is that they're balloon payouts. Keselowski, Kenseth, Edwards. Edwards, in my opinion, and Kenseth got forced out for money reasons. But like guys like Keselowski, obviously he had his deal with Roush. That kind of gave him the incentive to walk away from Penske and go a different direction in his career. That's fine. But Jimmy Johnson's another guy in a Chevy ride. That's another one that, and Bowman. I don't know about that one too. We can talk about that right now. Is the sport's heading in that direction where they're cutting salaries out, but the quality of talent. You're paying a guy for $1 million, and you're seeing sporadic results. A guy like Kyle Busch, you're going to tell me a guy like Kyle Busch doesn't deserve $10 million? 12?
Yeah, I think you got to look at it from a market perspective. I mean, if the sponsorship dollars aren't there, if X, Y, and Z sponsor that was spending $20 million is spending $10 million, and you've got to find a way to backfill that, it's impossible. I mean, it's very, very difficult. I think would TRD, Toyota, Joe Gibbs Racing love to still have Kyle Busch and sign him up long term, and to where he would drive that car until he said, "I'm done"? Absolutely. But when it comes down to a dollars and cents standpoint, it's very hard to justify it if you just don't have the funding. I mean, you figure, like we talked about, they did have a sponsor on the hook that they thought was going to be able to fill that hole for Mars, and it fell through. And a typical sales cycle, is a 12 to 14 month deal. I think where JGR was hoping, if they could get a deal done with Kyle, would have been, hey, we'll give you a heavily incentive laden contract, buy us a year, and then from there we can figure out what can happen long term. Similar to what happened at Penske with Brad Keselowski. He signed a 1-year extension, and they tried to get a long-term deal done, but it didn't work out. So I think from that perspective, Kyle looked at it, and his business people looked at it and said, okay, we can either sign a balloon 1-year deal, stay, or we can find something long-term that can take you probably through the rest of your career and go from there. And obviously, I think he wanted stability of knowing where he was going to be long term. I think he didn't want to go into 2023 with the constant hounding of the media and the press saying, "Hey, like, when are you guys going to get a deal done?" When everyone knows he signed a 1-year contract. So, I think that this will put a lot of that stuff to bed. And I think now it's just the fact of just finishing out the season at JGR, and then looking towards 2023 and seeing if he can take, a team that, has been competitive and both cars made the playoffs, but now taking it from being a contender to from just a contender to now a championship contender. That'll be
I'll say this. I'll close out with this. I think Toyota could have, and of course I don't know all the details behind the scenes, but I think Toyota could have superseded over JGR and said, "This is what we're going to do." And I'm saying not pull the trump card on this, but per se. But I think because you can hear, if you actually read the press releases by everybody at Toyota, they are very, very, very disappointed in that whole scenario and the way it played out. But at the same time, if they're so disappointed, why didn't they try to keep arguably the most successful Toyota driver that they've had in their stable? And I understand it's a funding thing and everyone has to make a living, doing what they do. But arguably, what my point was from the beginning of this podcast was Toyota not making a move of some kind has now affected a lot more than just Kyle Busch. It affected obviously a handful of drivers in the truck series, which that has one less Toyota truck team in the truck series. Also has less seats available for these TRD, which obviously Toyota will make contingency plans for these drivers. But for a young person perspective, it causes a lot of anxiety. And I think for race fans out there to watch a guy like John Hunter Nemechek basically make a huge monumental move to go from one high-end racing series back to arguably what is lower of the truck series. Obviously, his father was a great truck series driver. But to go there and now have to make contingency plans now for next season. And he said it in post-race at Kansas. He's stressed out. If you watch a John Hunter Nemechek post-race interview after Kansas, he says, hey, I'm going through some personal stuff. And he knows what's on the horizon. Like you can kind of tell, obviously, behind the scenes, Chris, what the motorsports racing community was going through. Obviously, they leaked that story out Friday. They knew they were going to announce it on a Tuesday. But everybody that was involved with this deal knew about it over the weekend. And unfortunately, I think Toyota could have said, hey, listen, this is what we're doing. We'll bridge the gap. We'll give you the extra $4 million to keep you here. But JGR, you have to commit to finding him a deal, a long-term deal. And I think that's what's important. I mean, I'll close out with that, Chris. I think I appreciate you joining me for this episode. And hopefully everyone join us on social media. Feel free to download the episode and like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Take a look at the Patreon and stuff. But, yeah, man. Thanks for joining me.
Do it next week.
Oh, yeah, another fun time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Yankee Cowboy Podcast. Feel free to join us on social media to continue these great conversations and more.